Well, welcome everyone. We're going to get started in just a little while. It'll take a little while for people to come into the Zoom room. This is Catherine Turcer from Common Cause, Ohio. We're here today to talk about dark money and what we can do about it. And there are a number of transparency reform options. We have the opportunity today to hear from Bryanna Austin, who's a legislative aide for Representative Gayle Manning. We also have Patrick Llewellyn, who is with the Campaign Legal Center. We have Vandewalker from the Brennan Center for Justice and Costa. And so we'll get started in just a moment. Anyway, welcome again. I'm really glad that we're here to talk about dark money. Many of us were startled what was just last month with the story about the householder enterprise. And it became really clear that we needed to shine a light on dark money. And it's certainly something that, that we've been talking about for a really long time. It's, more than 10 years since Citizens United versus FEC was decided. And it became really clear that we need to do something now. And whenever there is a scandal, there's also an opportunity to do a reform measure that will truly make a difference. And today we're going to highlight House Bill 737. And we have the first batter up in the list of speakers is going to be Bryanna Austin. She is the legislative aide from the office of State Rep Gayle Manning. And then we're going to hear from Patrick Llewellyn, who is the senior legal counsel from the Campaign Legal Center. He's going to talk about some policy options, what's been effective, and to really give us a sense of what policies might work and where there might be some gaps. Then we're going to hear from Costa, and Jay is the executive director of Voters' Right to Know. And I have to say, I love the name of his organization because we do have the right to know, and it just puts it out front. It reminds me a little of our fair districts equal fair elections. It just makes it really clear what we're about. Now, Jay is somebody who works with many different states, and he's going to tell you a little bit, a little bit about like what are the challenges with actually following the money and getting to the original source of contributions. And then he's going to talk about, what other states have done and some current campaigns as well. And then we're going to have a discussion. And I think we're really blessed because Vandewalker from the Brennan Center for Justice is joining us again. And in this case, we'll be able to have, a number of experts talk about how is it that we can in fact get the transparency that we need, because transparency is really all about accountability. And so our first person up is Bryanna. Now, Bryanna Austin has been the legislative aide for Representative Gayle Manning for 3 years. This is her first week of law school at Capital U. And I should also let you know that she was a fellow in the Legislative Service Commission. And so I'm going to let her tell you a little bit about House Bill 737. Thank you, Bryanna.
Thanks, Catherine, and thank you, everybody. I'm grateful for the invitation to be here tonight. I am standing in for the representative. She had something else on her calendar tonight, but like I said, I'm grateful to be here. A little bit about Representative Manning. She represents portions of Lorain County. She represents Avon Lake, Elyria, North Ridgeville, her hometown, Elyria Township, Grafton Village, and Sheffield Village. And she was an educator for 37 years, elementary grades 2 to 5, but mainly 3rd grade. And so education policy is her main focus. And as we may or may not know, education policy is a complicated world, and so is campaign finance. So she keeps me busy, but I appreciate that. I'm here to talk about House Bill 737, as Catherine mentioned, and in addition to Representative Manning, she has a joint sponsor, Representative Miranda from the Cincinnati area. We can go ahead with the next slide. So, as Catherine mentioned, it's been 10 years since the Citizens United decision, and there is a loophole in Ohio law currently. And so, House Bill 737 aims to close that loophole and essentially require it would enact reporting requirements for corporations and labor organizations when it comes to independent expenditures, or dark money as it's known. If we can go to the next slide. So big picture, I'm a big picture person, so I like to boil it down to a simple concept and then we can get into the weeds. But essentially, as I mentioned, what the bill does, it establishes 2 reporting requirements: independent expenditures on corporations and labor unions. And I've got a little handy definition for independent expenditures in case we don't know. And then it also talks about electioneering communication and reporting requirements for that, specifically during election years. And those are the 2 big ticket items that are in the bill. Also, there's a little change in the bill when it comes to reporting amounts and thresholds and things like that. But essentially, those are the 2 big things that House Bill 737 aims to do. It just brings transparency to campaign finance. And so the bill, we can exit out of this thank you. So the bill right now, Representative Miranda and Representative Manning have been having interested party meetings with interested parties. I know the Secretary of State, they sat down with Secretary LaRose. They also had a Zoom with Catherine, thank you for joining us on that, and League of Women Voters. And I know that we got a letter recently from the Ohio Elections Commission, and so they're very interested in the bill too. So the representatives are in the process right now of talking to all the interested parties and teasing the bill out, hearing feedback and getting suggestions and working together on that. The bill has not been assigned to a committee in the House yet. The Rules and Reference Committee has not met, but they are meeting next week. And so we anticipate a referral to a House committee next week. And so it will go through the committee process in the House, and then if it gets voted out of committee, it will be on the floor for a vote, and then hopefully get voted out of the House, and then go through the same process over in the Senate. And I think that is all I've got for you.
So maybe other people wondered about this, Bryanna. When you said that there were changes, do you mean that the Senate, do you mean that the state rep is already considering amendments to the bill?
Yes, so both representatives have taken lists of changes from the organizations I mentioned, and we are having the Legislative Service Commission. For those who aren't familiar with LSC, it is a nonpartisan commission of very, very smart attorneys who actually draft our laws for us. They serve the legislature in that way. So the representatives are in the process of working on amendments in a substitute bill. So that substitute bill is still in the works. It has not been introduced yet because, like I said, the bill hasn't been referred to committee. So they haven't had a chance to formally accept those changes. And we are still working through those changes, so there could even be some more before we get to the committee process.
Can you tell me a little bit about when you expect the bill to be considered?
So I know that Representative Manning has spoken with the speaker, and this is a high priority bill for both Representative Manning and Miranda, as we know with the recent scandal with the former House Speaker. So this is a high priority, and there's no better time than now to start working on this. I know that the representative, when she ran in 2018, there was a mailer against her opponent, and it was dark money, and it really bothered the representative because it was a very personal attack on her opponent, and it bothered her a lot. And so we actually started doing some research in the winter of 2019, November, December, and she spoke with then Senator Husted because he carried the bill in 2010. And so she had a conversation with Lieutenant Governor Husted about the bill. And like I said, with the recent scandal, you know, things just progressed from there.
Now, are you hoping, or or is your boss hoping to actually move the bill or have the bill passed during the lame duck session?
Yes, that is her goal.
So now one of the things that I will let you all know is that there's a chat function, and I would encourage you, one, to look in there because you're going to find the House Bill 737. You can actually find the document and download it and read it yourself, which after all the talk about this, you might actually want to do. And then also, please, put questions in there as we're going. I'm going to ask a few as we go along, just to so that we can get a better understanding. So this is a question here from Andy. Andy's from Dayton. He says, does this bill require disclosure of contributions to and expenditures from these PACs or by these dark money organizations? And so this actually brings up a good question. What's the difference between kind of an independent expenditure and a PAC?
So independent expenditures are not authorized, like they're not authorized by the candidate. And so there's the difference there. And the bill aims to bring in line reporting requirements with PACs.
All right, well, we're going to move on to our friend Patrick Llewellyn, who is the senior legal counsel for the Campaign Legal Center. Patrick, if you want to start putting your slides up, that would be good. I want to tell you a little bit about Patrick. His work at the Campaign Legal Center focuses on partnering with state organizations and local organizations like us to seek to implement campaign finance reforms. Now, prior to the Campaign Legal Center, joining the Campaign Legal Center, Patrick actually litigated public interest lawsuits as an attorney at Public Citizen. And he was also a teaching fellow at the Georgetown Law Civil Rights Clinic. Patrick, anything I'm missing in your bio?
No, I think you covered everything, Catherine. I appreciate it. I just want, so thank you, and just want to start by saying thanks very much for inviting me to be here tonight. Happy to be joining everyone and having this conversation about the importance of transparency reform in Ohio. As Catherine said, I'm with the Campaign Legal Center. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C. That advances democracy through law, and we do that using a number of tactics, including litigation, policy advocacy, communications, and partnerships to win victories that result in a more transparent, accountable, and responsive democracy. So happy to be here, and I'll just sort of jump in and just wanted to say, first of all, thanks very much to Bryanna for providing some background on HB 737 and a perspective on how the bill works and where it will go through the Ohio legislature. At CLC, we've analyzed HB 737 as well, and I wanted to offer an overview of our thoughts on what the bill does, in particular, how it fits into existing law and some policies that we think are not there right now, but that could be incorporated to strengthen the transparency requirements and help enable true transparency in Ohio elections. So I think, as I said, it's important to start just by understanding a little bit about the current framework in Ohio law, which mainly is groups are placed into a variety of categories. That is, groups that spend money to influence elections. And some of these terms, I know Bryanna mentioned some of them, and you might be familiar with them, are Political Action Committee, also known as PACs. And those are groups with a primary or major purpose of supporting or opposing a candidate or influencing the result of elections. Continuing associations, which are permanent associations that have a primary purpose other than influencing, supporting or opposing candidates, and explicitly includes 501c3, C4, and C6 nonprofits. and then political contributing entities, or sometimes called PCEs as I understand it, which are groups that may lawfully make election-related contributions and expenditures, but explicitly do not include PACs or PCEs. And under existing Ohio law, the disclosure and reporting obligations for all these entities, for the most part, flows from how they are categorized. And as Bryanna was saying, there is a gap in coverage right now for corporations that spend money in Ohio elections, which seems to mostly stem from guidance from the state saying that corporations do not or cannot be considered political contributing entities or PCEs. So that leaves a gap in coverage for disclosure obligations for corporations. And HB 737 places explicit disclosure obligations on corporations, and that's a good thing because there is a gap in corporations being able, in corporations being covered by existing disclosure obligations. But the way 737 does it is largely by putting these new disclosure obligations on top of or as part of the existing framework with these various categories. And by doing so, it leaves in place a system of categorization of groups that can lead to ambiguities about what group is covered under what category or how they label themselves, and as a result, what disclosure obligations might flow from that. And additionally, there's a couple of areas that HB 737 just doesn't address, and that we think without inclusion will continue to leave voters in the dark about who is truly spending big money to influence Ohio elections. So that's what I'd like to turn to now are some suggestions for improving transparency, and specifically three policies that we think could be included that would result in meaningful transparency of big money being spent in Ohio elections. The first, which is something I've already alluded to, would be ensuring that across the board, all big spenders are covered by disclosure and disclaimer requirements, regardless of organizational form. And at its simplest and most straightforward, that would be something like just setting a threshold dollar amount that applies across the board. And once a spender spends that amount of money, the disclosure and disclaimer requirements apply to that group or person, regardless of the organizational form that group chooses to take. There's another pending bill right now, HB 739, that I think takes a step in the right direction on this by it proposes to entirely eliminate the category of continuing associations from Ohio campaign finance law. And I think that's a good step because not only would it, reduce the number of categories, but in doing so, it would reduce the potential ambiguity about how certain nonprofits would be classified under Ohio law. The second that I wanted to point to, and I think this is vitally important, is tracing back contributions and donations to their original sources. And it's not difficult to see why disclosure without tracing back to original sources would lead to incomplete information. In only disclosing the immediate source of the money, rather than the original source of the money that's being spent in elections, wealthy special interests can insulate themselves from disclosure obligations by passing money through intermediaries. And I wanted to mention that based on what I understand about how Generation Now operated, and Generation Now being the C4 that was at the center of the recent public corruption scandal that was allegedly controlled by former Speaker Householder, that seems to be the role that Generation Now largely played. At least in the 2018 legislative races, Generation Now seemingly received millions of dollars from the power company, and then passed along that money to a PAC and to another group that ultimately spent the money to influence the outcome of those legislative races. But as we all know, the issue wasn't identifying Generation Now as the source of the money, but identifying where Generation Now received its money to then pass along for the spending. So I just wanted to point that out because, if the tracing back stops at the immediate source, the disclosure will just will often just be some intermediary group without actually going back to the true source of the money. And that's why it's important that a traceback is included as part of the disclosure obligations. And then lastly, updating the coverage of Ohio law to ensure that political digital advertising is included. And by way of example, under current Ohio law, and I think this was already mentioned, it regulates something called electioneering communications. And those are communications that mention a specific candidate that's running for office and that occur within a particular time frame close to an election, but fall short of what's called expressly advocating for or against a candidate. So they don't say things like vote for X or vote against Y. So those are electioneering communications, and it explicitly covers only certain forms of media, and in fact explicitly excludes digital ads from the coverage of electioneering communications. And that's very similar to federal law and how it operates. And as we all know, digital advertising at this point is ubiquitous, including digital political advertising. And in fact, I believe it was projected that this year, overall political digital advertising would reach nearly $3 billion. So digital political advertising is huge. It's a huge source of money that's being spent in elections. And there's no reason why there should be loopholes for political communications just because of the type of medium that's used. And in particular, it's important in the modern era to ensure that digital ads are covered. And lastly, I just wanted to mention two additional policies that we think would be important reforms and that go hand in hand with the three policies that I've already mentioned, but I won't spend quite as much time on them, but did want to make sure to bring them up. The first is strengthening coordination laws to ensure that independent spending is truly independent. And that's because contribution limits play an important role in guarding against political corruption and in ensuring that office holders are accountable to all citizens, not just to their biggest donors. But coordination between outside spenders and candidates completely undermines those limits and the bases behind those limits. And so, that's why it's important to prevent coordination between independent spenders, which can spend unlimited amounts of money, and campaigns, because otherwise it'll allow wealthy special interests to indirectly bankroll their preferred candidates. And then lastly, broadening protections against foreign interference in elections. Now, federal law already provides some protections that apply to state and local elections, but again, there's gaps. And in particular, there's gaps when it comes to foreign controlled corporations, by which I mean corporations that might be formed under or operate under American law, but are controlled in substantial part by foreign entities. And then foreign interference generally in ballot initiative elections. And at this point, after the last couple of national elections, I think it's pretty clear, and we can all appreciate that there's a danger of foreign interference in our elections. And so, I bring this up because there is a gap in what federal law covers, and when considering campaign finance reform at the state or local level, this is an important gap that can be filled to safeguard our elections. And so that's all I have for my presentation, but of course, I'm happy to talk more in the discussion portion about questions or details or what else comes up. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Patrick, we appreciate hearing from you, and I bet you there will be lots of questions once we get into the discussion portion of the program. I appreciated your taking time to really dive in and think about House Bill 737 and really focus on Ohio. And the next person that is actually going to provide us with a presentation is Jay Costa. Now, Jay is the Executive Director for the Voters' Right to Know. Before that, he was the Executive Director at, I love this, CounterPAC. And CounterPAC was a nonpartisan political committee devoted to fighting dark money. So he's just what we need to hear from, he's just who we need to hear from. The other thing I wanted to highlight is that he worked on Berkeley's Fair Campaign Practices Commission, and he also did research on money in politics I actually got my interest in money in politics and doing what we can when it comes to transparency and dark money because of my work in the money in politics, on research. That was what really got me thinking, well, wait a second, we need additional information. So Jay, I'm not quite sure if we're able to see what you have going on here. It's black. Is that what other people are seeing as well?
Let's try something else.
There we go.
You're able to see that now?
All right, well, thank you so much, Jay, for joining us. We really appreciate it, and I'm just gonna let you take it away.
Terrific. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay, well, thanks very much, Catherine. It's great to be here and be joining this conversation. My name is Jay Costa. I'm the Executive Director of Voters' Right to Know, which, as Catherine said, is a nonpartisan group that works on the problem of transparency of the money being spent to influence elections. So this is right up our alley. And in fact, we also focus specifically on this problem at the state level. And the reason that we do that is because we think in general, there's the greatest opportunity to make advances on this problem in the states because of how stuck things are in the federal government. And, we've seen really great examples of other issues advancing up through the states. And so we think that when it comes to reform of money in politics, the state level is a really great opportunity. So I've been watching quite intently, as this scandal has been unfolding in Ohio, because as those of us who are on the inside of this space like to say, you never let a good scandal go to waste. So I think that, coming off of the scandal, there's really a great opportunity in Ohio to move this issue forward. But I will, just want to put things into a bit of perspective. Ohio is far from the only place where this issue is a problem. Over the last decade, there's been more than $1 billion spent in secret by these dark money groups. And, so why should we care about that? Well, one reason is that the vast majority of dark money goes to buy negative advertising. You compare that with the ads that candidates run themselves, which is just about 1% of it is negative. And that's because candidates have to stand by their ads. And so you don't have, candidates don't want to be associated with running attack ads. But when people are allowed to wear a mask and, wave things around in voter spaces, they can say whatever they want. So that's one reason. The other reason, and this is actually kind of more substantive if you ask me, dark money is really how special interests win right now. They're able to hide behind these shell groups and thereby hide their true identities from voters, and in doing so gain a level of credibility that they wouldn't otherwise have. So it's kind of, I like to think of it as the Wizard of Oz effect. You have Dorothy and friends watching this big scary guy and basically feeling like they have to do whatever he says, this wizard, even though it's actually just this old man behind the curtain pulling levers and telling them what to do. But because it looks like, the Wizard of Oz, they go off and, go on this big adventure because he tells them to. So the problem in this dark money scheme is that they really only ever see the first level back, right? They don't get to see who's really behind the curtain. And that's the same problem that we face with dark money spenders. So the solution that we advocate for, and as Catherine said, it's kind of right in our name, is this idea that we should have a right to know the true original sources of the money being spent to influence our elections. And the one nit I will make on Catherine's point is actually that in most cases, in the vast majority of cases, we don't actually have the right to know the true original sources of money. We think that we should. 81% of American voters, and that's across the ideological spectrum, think that we should. But actually, in the only place where we have that right to know right now is in North Dakota, and we were part of a campaign in 2018 to get that passed. voters there put an amendment on the ballot to pass a constitutional, state level constitutional amendment, giving themselves the right to know the true sources of political spending. But it's important to dial in on what we actually mean by the true original sources. And Patrick got into this a bit already, but it's basically, this Russian nesting doll scenario where you have one donor giving to another donor, giving to another donor, who gives to the person who finally spends the money to influence voters. And so, when we talk about voters knowing the true source, we want them to know that in my diagram here, it's actually donor A who started this whole chain. Now you might say, well, isn't that just going to be a huge headache, a huge burden? Isn't this going to chill people's speech? Well, no, we would argue. And the reason why is because we're not just doing this carte blanche. We are saying in every state where we do this, we want to set an appropriate threshold. First of all, for the person who's spending the money, but then also for the people who are donating that money. And basically, so an important thing to know, fun fact, is that actually in America, less than 1% of people give more than $200 to any given political campaign. And so, for example, let's just talk about $5,000 threshold, both for spenders and for donors. That's not going to even apply to the vast majority of people. It's only going to apply to the small percent of people who are giving money in big sums. But so even for them, say they gave $2,500 or they spent $2,500. Under this model, they wouldn't have to report anything. All of a sudden, they hit that $5,000 threshold. Now the voters get to see they're spending that money. But say that they only took money in $2,500 increments. They never have to report who their donors are. Suddenly, the donors cross, in this case, donor C crosses that $5,000 threshold. Well, now the voter gets to see that it's donor C who gave money to the spender who spent the money. And it goes all the way back down the line. If actually donor C got its money from donor B, then voters should get to see that's where the money is coming from. Same thing all the way back down the chain. And that is this idea of original money. So it needs to be, if you're getting your money from somebody other than your own income, or in the case if you happen to be a corporation, the money that you're making in the scheme of real commerce that you're engaged in, then you need to tell us where that money is coming from, because that's not original money. So in Arizona, this past year, we helped to support a measure that was headed toward the ballot. Unfortunately, we had about 300,000 signatures when COVID began, and it had to stop collecting, which was quite disappointing. But it's in my opinion, very good policy, and I would urge you to take a look at it. They had a $10,000 threshold on the spender, a $5,000 threshold on donations to that spender, and anything above that needs to be reported. And then there's a measure that actually will be on the ballot in Alaska. The campaign is called, and the measure is called the Alaskans for Better Elections measure. And they actually go a little bit further and say that any independent expenditure that is made in a given cycle, the spender has to report contributions of $2,000 or more that it has received. And so we think that that's a really great step forward as well. I think both of these pieces of policy are really worth taking a look at. There are a number of states who have done things on disclosure, but I actually think these are the two most forward-looking, and in large part, I'll give Patrick a lot of credit. It's because Campaign Legal Center has been such a thought leader in this space, and really has pointed, I think, toward a model that I hope will be adopted more and more. Couple other things before I just wrap, and basically I'll say, in addition to it being a right, getting at true original sources, having state appropriate thresholds, I will say the information should be available both online and on the ads themselves. It should apply to all media, including digital media, and you need to put into place enforcement mechanisms that are effective and really can make sure that people are following the rules. Usually that looks like an independent state agency of some sort that can, that isn't politically elected, that is able to make sure that people are following the law and impose fines when they aren't. So I'll wrap it there, but happy to take any questions on anything and excited for the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Jay, thank you so much. If you want to end your screen share, we've got all of the different people that are part of the panel at this point, and there were people that were popping in questions, so now is the time that we're actually going to have more of a discussion. But before we do that, I wanted to be sure that I introduce Ian Vandewalker from the Brennan Center for Justice. One of my favorite things about Ian is that, in fact, he got a master's degree in philosophy from Indiana University, which is nearby, and he has a deep interest in money and politics. He is senior counsel for the democracy program at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University, where he works to address the influence of money in politics and foreign interference in US elections. I'm going to encourage you all, if you have questions, to put them into, there's like a Q&A function, and you can also put them in the chat. One of the things that's nice is Jessica is in there looking for questions. And so I'm going to start with some of the questions that, that have popped up during our discussion. This might be a good one for Bryanna. What are the odds of House Bill 737, or for that matter, House Bill 739, which is a different disclosure legislation? What are the odds of these things actually passing? And Bryanna, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
So, sorry, had to unmute myself. So, these conversations are taking place with the legislators. They have been taking place since the end of July. And I think that there's a desire to do something by the end of the year because, lame duck's coming up. And at the end of this year, we start the new General Assembly for the next 2 years. And that means that the bill has to start over in the process. So there's a deep desire to get something done now because we don't want to start over, and also we don't want another scandal that happened a couple months ago. So I think the odds are good. As we know, the name of the game is compromise, and each side's going to have to compromise. But I think that is what the legislative process is all about.
Patrick, I have a question for you. There is a belief by some that deep-pocketed entities will always find a way to get around regulations that they don't like. Is that true?
Well, I mean, if there's no regulations in place at all, it's pretty easy. So, I think that speaking more generally, that can be an argument against trying to have laws in place on any topic that, someone is going to attempt to break the law or find some way of evading it. But that doesn't mean that there aren't common sense, good policies that can be put in place to address the problems as we see them. And I think that, dark money, big spending in elections where people don't know the sources of it is a big problem. That's what we see. That's what this event was about. And there are available policies that can address that problem. That some people might break the law, it is something that will come up with any law. But I mean, I don't think that that's a good reason to not put in policies that we have, strong reason to believe would actually address the problem.
So this one is going to be for Ian. Ian, what are the states that you think have good disclosures, that have done a good job at getting at dark money?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thanks for having me here. As Jay knows, California has done a lot lately to expand its disclosure regime, including, increasing what's required in the ad itself, applying things to online ads, as Patrick mentioned, is definitely necessary. And then Montana is also often brought up as a good example of dark money disclosure. They have a long history there of, because of the mining industry, sort of industry capture of the legislature through political spending, including secret political spending, and they're very sensitive to the need for limits on campaigns spending, including a good usable disclosure.
And now I have a question for Jay. In this case, it has to do with what are the kinds of things that individuals can do? So this is from Mindy. She says, you know, is there anything that we can do now to help? Should we be writing our legislators? What are the kinds of things that citizens can actually do to move this so that we can shine a light on dark money?
I think that that's exactly right. I mean, I think this is a great, this call is a great example. And, you know, the fact that Bryanna is here, you know, representing a legislative leader on this issue, I mean, seems like a great opportunity to be sharing thoughts. And I do think that, you know, meeting with legislators, writing to legislators, and expressing, you know, support for taking action on this issue, I know it always means a lot to legislators to hear directly from constituents. And so I do think that would be great. And I mean, the bottom line is that there are good examples out there of how to take action on this issue from a policy perspective. And so I think, you know, helping to elevate those, maybe some of the examples that we've talked about on this call would be a great step.
Bryanna, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
I think Jay made a good point. I can speak for Representative Manning. She sees every single email that we get, and we keep a call log in our office. And over the summer, she's gotten into a habit of calling everybody who calls and emails. And so I think that's a good way for her to have conversations, because someone might write in about one topic, but she might have a conversation about dark money when she gives them a call back. So I think the interactions that you do have with your legislator are good steps. So I just have to echo what Jay said.
If I could also just add one more follow-up thought on that too. You know, I think the other thing to consider is that, you know, Ohio is one of the states where there's a right of citizens to collect signatures to put things on the ballot directly and to petition voters directly through the ballot. And that, for Voters' Right to Know, actually has been one of the most successful channels of getting really, you know, strong policy moving in the direction of passage. You know, both of the measures that I talked about earlier were voter-driven initiatives. And so, you know, I think it would be amazing for the legislature to pass something during the lame duck session that addressed this problem, and I hope it does. You know, in the event that it doesn't, for whatever reason, I think that's another really interesting channel that citizen activists should be thinking about.
Well, one of the things that I really liked that Rep. Manning said during a press conference with the Secretary of State and Representative Miranda was basically saying that legislators are going to take action about dark money and close this loophole so that we get significantly more transparency, simply because voters are going to be making phone calls, they're going to be writing letters, they're going to be demanding it. And it seemed really clear to me when she was saying that we really do need to make it clear that this is something that we really care about. There are many, many other issues that we all worry about, but no matter what your big issue is, we care about accountability and making sure that we have good disclosure and good transparency. We can do so much to root out corruption and to understand who is trying to influence our vote. And so I was really pleased when she made the recommendation that we all send a letter, send an email, make a phone call. And I would encourage all of us tomorrow to make a phone call, call your state rep, let them know what you're thinking about disclosure, because we definitely deserve access to this information. Now, I have a question here. This one is for Patrick. This was a question that came from a reporter, and which was asked earlier. She wanted to know, to what extent is there an interplay or overlap between federal and state law on election disclosure and dark money issues?
Well, I mean, I guess as I understand the question, it's, you know, if a group spends money in federal elections, then, you know, then the laws in place for how PACs or independent spenders report to the FEC would apply. But if they're spending money in state or local elections, then it's really the state and local laws that are going to apply as to how they report their expenditures and how they register and all of that. So, I mean, there can certainly be overlapping requirements if the same group is spending money in federal elections and also spending money in state and local elections. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, if there's a group operating and they have to report under federal law, that they're immediately going to have to report under state law. I don't know if I answered this question, but I take it just that yes, there can be groups that, you know, might only be spending money in state elections and then are only reporting under state law or vice versa. But the different laws can overlap with each other in that way.
Ian, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think that it's, you know, it's a good idea for sort of usability on both sides, from reporting organizations and people who are reading it. It's a good idea to kind of make things all look basically the same, in as much as that's manageable or appropriate to the state. I do think, you know, some states do have double reporting requirements, but frequently just submitting your federal form to the state, or the other way around, not the other way around, just the one way, can, you know, can make compliance easier while still getting to the heart of the information.
Well, Ohioans are going to be starting to vote early in about, 5 weeks-ish. What, if anything, can be done now? Are there, what are recommendations for voters who want to be able to follow the money now?
I just think, you know, there's a lot of reporting now on this scandal, and sort of the tentacles expanding out from it, and that I think has generated interest in other kinds of special interest funding. But there are resources that exist, right? So opensecrets.org tracks federal money in politics. You can look up your congresspeople, you can look up presidential candidates there. There are similar resources for states. Followthemoney.org tracks a lot of independent spending in the states. That requires some level of reporting in the first place, which, as we've just talked about for an hour, is not airtight yet in Ohio, and as it is not in many states. But there are and organizations like ProPublica, journalistic organizations that specialize in money and politics, can be a great resource.
The next question is a very simple one. Is disclosure constitutional? This person has heard, that in fact, there are questions about whether it's constitutional or not. And I will throw that one to Patrick.
Well, that would be an enthusiastic yes from me. I mean, even in Citizens United, when the Supreme Court, changed the law on corporate independent expenditures, there was a broad majority of the court that upheld disclosure requirements in that case as applied to those expenditures. So yes, I mean, even as the law has shifted on, the way in which money is spent in politics, disclosure requirements have by and large been upheld and have been touted as the way in which voters are able to find out how, this money that is now flowing in, where it's coming from and how it's being spent. I mean, with all things, there's, on the edges, there's going to be some caveats as to things you can and can't do. But overall, yes, disclosure is constitutional.
Now I have a question from Ellen. This is a different Ellen. This is Ellen Greenbush. The other one was Ellen Worthington. Okay, so let's see. Basically what Ellen is interested in is, we've been talking a lot about transparency. And she's wondering about just the role of kind of the unlimited money and whether we should in fact be amending the Constitution, moving to amend the Constitution to say that money isn't speech and that corporations are not people. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, Ian.
Yeah, right. So this sort of accurately gets at part of the problem, which is when the Supreme Court decided Citizens United, what it said it was doing was interpreting the First Amendment to say that the richest people have a First Amendment right to spend the most money. Right. So organizations like the Brennan Center think that's an incorrect interpretation of the First Amendment. And we are working through the courts to basically get the court to change its mind. Another way of changing that outcome is to change the text of the Constitution itself. I'll note that, Citizens United didn't actually create the doctrine that corporations are people, or the doctrine, as much as it is a doctrine, that money is speech. It specifically said corporations, whatever their legal status, can spend unlimited amounts. So it's a little bit narrower than some of the rhetoric, which may be relevant to a constitutional amendment strategy, maybe not. Constitutional amendments are very hard. They're purposely very hard to do in the federal system. Takes a lot of time. It takes convincing a lot of states to approve them. And that's not a reason not to do it. Well, I guess it is a reason not to do it, but it might not be enough of a reason not to do it. So, I think that's one tack. The thing that I always say, and this is, again, not a killer consideration, I think, but even if the Constitution were amended and it came back to be interpreted by conservative justices who sort of hate the idea of regulating campaign finance, they may be able to still twist the language into a way that would protect rich special interests like they did in Citizens United. It's very hard to craft language, especially constitutional language, in a way that really ties the hands of future judges who want to do mischief on behalf of rich special interests.
Patrick, do you have something you want to add about Citizens United and perhaps the need to amend the Constitution?
I can. Jay, were you about to say something? I thought I heard someone.
Oh,
I don't want to cut somebody off.
That's okay. Well, I was going to tack on just very shortly, that I think obviously we have a problem of magnitude and, limits. However, I think Ian very eloquently sort of laid out the constraints there, and it is a huge uphill battle. And I guess the way that I would contextualize it in relationship to transparency is that, if you're trying to protect a city that is being, flooded year after year, obviously you want to do something about the flooding, right? You want to build a better seawall or better system of drainage or something. But if you don't have the money to do that right away, then that doesn't mean don't invest in a system of, flood alerts. You want your people to be able to know when the water is coming and to get away from it while you're working on getting your, bigger project done. And so that's kind of how I would almost put the two in relationship. Transparency is something that we can do now. It's incredibly popular. and it's something that the courts have given us constitutional space to do. And it has an impact, because when voters know who's spending the money in an election, they can take that information into account and vote for their own interest rather than what special interests want them to do. And hopefully one day we can solve the bigger problem of getting, the deluge of money just, more completely out of politics.
I don't think I have too much to add to what Ian and Jay said. I mean, I think I want to, just echo that in the short and medium term, as a practical possibility, a constitutional amendment on this is just not going to happen. And like I think both Jay and Ian have said, there are a lot of good laws that can pass scrutiny that we can pass now that would be meaningful from a transparency perspective, and that the courts would uphold, and also might provide an avenue to shift the court on how it views the First Amendment and what the First Amendment truly protects. So I don't know that I have much more to add other than that there's a lot of good we can do right now that doesn't depend on a constitutional amendment, which is not going to happen in the near term, and crafting a good constitutional amendment that is also going to be interpreted by a Supreme Court that either is the one that exists now or that looks very similar to it, raises lots of issues in and of itself.
And here I have a question for Bryanna. The question is, who is responsible for collecting campaign finance information and monitoring it in Ohio?
The campaign finance reports are on file with the Secretary of State, and those are all public on his website.
I noticed that the Secretary of State actually filed some complaints with the Elections Commission today. So one of the things that you all should know too is that this information is given to the Secretary of State. It's available electronically, so you can just Google Secretary of State. There's a campaign finance area, and you can both search and you can actually download. They call it the file transfer protocol area. I personally prefer to download it and actually look at it a little bit deeper rather than just using the search, but that function works really well. The Secretary of State does review those files to see if they're complete as much as possible. And then the complaints are sent to the Elections Commission. Anything else you wanted to add, Bryanna?
I think you covered it all.
All right, sounds good. So there were other kinds of questions that simply had to do with, this was from Nancy. Nancy's from Cincinnati. And she said, if I were a candidate, I would want limits on all sorts of things, so I wouldn't have to spend all my time raising money, and what am I missing? And so, like, if an ordinary person is looking at the system that we have, how is it that we got to this point where there seems to be just unlimited amounts of money, and candidates are put in a crunch that they have to raise so much? How did this happen? And I'll just throw it out to whoever wants to kind of answer that question.
Well, I think unfortunately a big part of the answer has to do with Citizens United. I mean, you could go back there, a lot of nuances to the history of campaign finance in America, but I think the ruling that basically said corporations could spend, unlimited amounts of money as long as they did so independent of a candidate campaign, gave rise to then this idea that, well, there's no reason why they can't pool their money. And that's like sort of what gave, this idea of super PAC is. It came out of a decision called Speech Now. And so it's, dating back a decade, really, that I think we got this problem in its current form. We can actually put limits into place for the amount of money that a candidate can receive directly. And most states have that. There are a couple of states that don't, but in terms of this money that's being spent on, quote unquote, the outside by independent groups, unfortunately, the Supreme Court has given us a limited amount that we can do about that. And what we can do is make sure it's fully transparent and make sure that it's truly independent. make sure that the groups that say that they're behaving independent of a candidate really are not coordinating with that candidate. They're not secretly raising money for the candidate. They're not, sharing consultants with the candidate. And, that's the other part, in my opinion, of what made this case so egregious, is that not only was it just an insanely good example of dark money, but actually is dark money that is being given to a group that was being completely controlled by, the Speaker of the House. So, that would be my answer, but be curious to hear what others have to say too.
Ian, looked like you were going to jump in.
Oh, Jay said very well all the things that I was going to say. I mean, it's just, we've gotten to this place where there's this arms race. Money doesn't, necessarily win elections, but you can't win elections without money. And, it's always the case that if there's some advantage that can be had, you want to have it, and more money seems like an advantage, so people are going to have it. People are going to pursue it, rather. It's that pursuit, it's the who do you call, who do you make promises to, who do you try to keep happy when you're raising money, that generates this sort of conflicts of interest and the power of special interests once the person becomes an elected official over the public interest. And, there are ways of interrupting that. There are ways to empower the public to hold politicians accountable. Transparency is one of those ways. It's certainly not the only thing, and maybe not the most powerful thing. But as Jay has said, and Patrick, it's constitutional. We can do it right now. There are models out there, and it should definitely it should be a no-brainer. It should be an easy step.
I always look back and I think about the 1970s when Congress passed contribution limits, so that, saying, hey, we want to root out quid pro quo, so we're going to have contribution limits. And they also did limits on spending. And the Supreme Court, Buckley versus Vallejo, said, well, we can limit, the contributions because, of course, we do want to root out quid pro quo. We need to make sure that, money is not unduly influencing folks. But because, money is spent on everything from yard signs to political ads, to all sorts of different ways that candidates get their message out, well, we can't actually limit that. And so once you say you can limit in one way and you can't limit in the other way, of course, candidates are going to be put into a bind, and the system will not make sense. And so, when we think about, what is common sense and what is constitutional, they don't exactly always completely go together, do they? So now we have just a few more questions. In this particular case, the next one is going to take me a moment to find. One of the things that where did it go? Andy had a question that I thought was interesting. Andy was interested in the notion of whether you would end up, and you actually mentioned this, Jay, which is why I was thinking about this, the notion of you would have multiple organizations or multiple C4s or multiple entities all attempting to influence and working in a coordinated fashion. Jay, you had talked a little bit about the donor disclosure. Can you tell me a little bit again about like how that would work? Because it wasn't completely clear to me.
Yeah, that's a great question, and admittedly, it is quite complicated to really, once you start talking about people passing money down a long chain. But actually, as one of Patrick's colleagues likes to say often, like, it's only complicated if you're doing complicated things. And that's unfortunately the cases that we're trying to go after, really, the most, are the people who are truly trying to hide money. But so to just really try to make it dead simple, there's a requirement that ultimately rests with the person or entity that is spending money to influence an election. if you're spending money above a certain threshold in an election, you need to be able to say who the original source of that money was. And again, by original source, we mean money that comes from a real person that they earned or inherited or something like that, or a corporation that it earned in the scheme of real commerce. You know, like, for example, money that, Verizon made from your cell phone bill this month or something like that. Not a shell company, not a 501c4 that got its money from donations. So it has to pierce back to the original source. And that means if they have to ask the contributor where it came from, then the contributor has to be able to tell them. And ultimately, if they can't find out, they have the choice not to spend that money. And, under the kind of law we're trying to advocate for, if they choose to spend money that they claim they don't know where it came from, they're making a choice to violate the law.
Anyone else
Yeah.
jump in on that?
I was going to add in, if Jay didn't, like he said, that these disclosure with tracing back to original sources, it's only complicated when people are doing complicated things, and I think Jay's right that in a lot of ways in which it can be set up, either the person spending the money or the person giving them the money to spend in an election in a particular state, that all along the way putting obligations on them as to where the money comes from. And just defining very clearly, as Jay said, what original source money is, so that when groups are spending money, they know, oh, we have to be able to trace this back to someone who made it from their job, or, just put generally, or a company that made it from their business. And everyone along the way has to be able to do that. So I think, the issue with groups setting up multiple entities to pass money along, that really raises the question of why are they doing that? And the only, for the most part, the reason is to hide the source of it. And so that's why you have to try to figure out ways to ensure that who's spending the money is reporting out, where the money is originally coming from.
Bryanna, this question is for you. Is there an enforcement mechanism in House Bill 737?
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we're having conversations with all the interested parties, and so that's actually something that was talked about. And so I know that both Representatives Manning and Miranda are working on that. What that looks like, they're still uncertain, but those conversations are being had.
Patrick, do you want to throw in anything about, recommendations for enforcement, fines, etc., what that could look like?
Well, I mean, I think, it was already touched on in some ways about having a strong enforcement agency, is one key to having a good campaign finance regime. And I think that means an agency that has the power to investigate and to obtain the records and information necessary to determine whether there's been a violation, not just to depend on, the compliance of regulated parties, but, to be able to get the information themselves, and potentially, and allowing for citizens to file their own complaints, and potentially incorporating private rights of actions to pursue that in court if the agency is not doing its job. I mean, there's lots of different ways in which you can build in enforcement mechanisms that can make the rules enforceable.
Ian, one of the things that they're considering is giving the Secretary of State the ability to subpoena records. Does that actually make sense to you?
Well, somebody needs to be able to enforce. I mean, as there's been sort of implicit throughout, having rules be a certain way gets people a lot of information, and even can sort of reveal, I mean, a lot of the things, if you read the householder, the criminal complaint, there was a lot of things that were reported that allowed investigators to connect the dots, with things that weren't. But there will always be people who won't do what they're supposed to do at all. And there has to be some kind of power to look for things that are not reported in the first place or things that are reported falsely. We don't at the Brennan Center have a position about where that enforcement should be, but I think that you need both, generally speaking, you need both criminal and civil enforcement. So somebody who's not a prosecutor who has the ability to, again, look at records and figure out what's actually happening in terms of the movement of money.
Well, I think this is going to be the last question. One of the things that was mentioned had to do with foreign interference in our elections. And, you know, the best way to do that. And I know that both Patrick and Ian have some background on this. Which one of you would like to answer this? You know, I realize this is a very round question, but what's the best way to get at foreign interference using transparency and disclosure? And whoever steps up to the plate first.
I'm happy to start off first. You know, I think that there's a couple of different things. One that I wanted to point to, because it is incorporated in some way in House Bill 739, and that I mentioned, is looking at foreign controlled corporations. And that's because under the federal definition of foreign national, which is, you know, the federal law prohibits foreign nationals from, you know, doing a lot of things when it comes to candidate elections, including at the state and local level. And under Ohio law, it pretty much just adopts the federal definition of foreign national for purposes of foreign interference. That definition includes corporations that are formed under foreign law. But because at the time the bill, you know, the law was put in place, you know, corporations were banned from making independent expenditures completely. So there wasn't quite so big of a gap. Now that corporations can make unlimited independent expenditures, there is a gap for corporations that are American corporations, but have substantial foreign ownership. And that, you know, and because of that, may have interests that align with their foreign ownership rather than with operating in the US. And so, you know, one way of doing that is by defining foreign national to include corporations that have certain amounts of foreign ownership. HB 739 does it by saying if there are in total if foreign ownership in total is 20% or more, the corporation counts as a foreign national, or if any one owner that is a foreign entity has 5% or more of an ownership share, then it also counts as a foreign national. So that's only going to reach corporations, and there's, you know, things that can be done to reach unincorporated groups as well that may have a substantial amount of foreign control within them. But I think that's one important area that is already being done, you know, is already being incorporated in part in 739 that could easily be incorporated as bringing in foreign controlled corporations as part of the definition of foreign nationals that are banned from making contributions or expenditures related to candidate elections.
Well, I wanted to thank you all so much for being panelists and helping us consider House Bill 737. You know, I just wanted to ask each of you to say a few words to wrap up, things that you like folks to leave with. Patrick, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to go first. I guess I would just wrap up by saying that, you know, I thought Jay made a great point that when there are big scandals, people get very interested in making change. And, you know, instead of just passing something to pass something, this can be a great point to make meaningful change and incorporate true transparency that'll let folks get, you know, understand who's spending big money in their elections. And so I think that, you know, I hope if folks take anything away, it's trying to interrogate and look at, you know, what are the ways in which we can find out how big money is influencing our elections.
Thank you. Ian?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that I think that's exactly right for our concluding thought here, that scandal is a great opportunity for reform. I mean, it's not a good thing to be happy about, but it can lead to, there can be the silver lining of finding reform. And I would think that, as people have mentioned, communicating with your legislators and not letting people off the hook if something doesn't go this year. You know, if there's an election, you can speak directly to this question in elections for state representative and senator, and then to make sure that the reform is meaty. It's not just, like you said, a Band-Aid, that it gets to real transparency, and maybe you know, other campaign finance reforms as well.
How about you, Jay?
Yep, just to echo, I think, you know, real opportunity and also, you know, real need. You know, we don't want this kind of thing to be able to happen again anywhere, but certainly not someplace where it has just happened, like Ohio. And so I think that this is, you know, let's capitalize on the opportunity to get something done. I think we should definitely do everything we can to take advantage of this legislative upcoming lame duck session, and would really urge folks to engage on that. If anybody does have questions or is interested in the ballot measure channel, you know, we've done a lot of work on that front, and I'd always be happy to talk with anybody who has questions about the possibility of getting a ballot measure going. But the main thing I would just say is that, you know, whatever is done really does need to be strong. It's not enough to just, you know, say that we're doing disclosure. I think it's really key that we don't just require spenders to report their contributors, but to report the original sources of the money. If I've left you with nothing else, that should be the main point. Like, we need to go all the way back to the original source, because otherwise there will always be a way to, you know, get around letting voters know who's really trying to influence their vote.
Thank you. Bryanna, last but not least, do you have a few things you'd like to leave us all with?
Sure. Take, you know, 5 simple minutes out of your day to contact your legislator, call or email. You know, it really does make a difference whether people do believe it or not. I know that it's feedback from the district is very important to each lawmaker, and it helps them make decisions down in Columbus. So I strongly encourage people to engage.
Well, and I was really left with, when Bryanna was talking about the changes that they're considering, it's really important for us to realize that, you know, the draft bill that is first produced, is introduced, that it continues to change throughout the process. And there are a couple different amendments, you know, that I'm pushing for. For example, I'm very interested in stronger anti-coordination rules. You'll notice that we put in a link that gives a little bit of information about some of the reforms that we're recommending, and we're asking you to send an email off tonight. Also, I'm going to let you know that we're going to send you, you know, slides slides and the recording of this discussion, and then, you know, if there are questions that we did not get answered, and I know there are, we will make sure that we follow up with you as much as possible. And I just wanted to thank everybody for participating tonight. And let's go shine some light on that dark money. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, panelists. Have a good evening.